Services are another fundamental feature of AngularJS. Angular offers several useful services, some of which we've already seen in this course, like the $HTTP service. But for most applications, you will also want to be able to write your own custom services. But before we can talk about custom services, we need to stop for a moment and understand exactly what is a service. In Angular, a service is a function or an object, and is used to share data or behavior across controllers, directives, filters, and other services. Angular services are lazily instantiated, meaning that Angular only instantiates a service when an application component depends on it. And there are also singletons, meaning that each component that depends on a service gets a reference to the single instance generated by the service factory. This is different, for example, from a controller, of which many instances can be created. Like other core Angular identifiers, built-in services always start with the $, but the $sign is not mandatory for custom services. To use an Angular service, you'll add it as a dependency for the component, being it a controller, service, filter, or directive that depends on the service. Here is an example from section 3 exercise, where we inject in the service called movie API service. AngularJS dependency injection takes care of the rest for you. When it comes to declare custom services in AngularJS, there are a few different ways to do that. Those are called service recipes. There are 4 different service recipes you can use: the value recipe, constant, service, and factory. The first 2 are quite simple. Value and constant are services that are supposed to be used when all you want the service to do is to return a simple object. Here's an example of a service that returns the string hello world using the value recipe. You can use it in your controller or in other services by simply injecting the service and invoking its name. The constant recipe works basically the same way. The difference between a value and a constant service is that the first can only be injected in a service or a controller, while the second can also be injected into a module configuration function. Then we have 2 more service recipes. They're called service and factory. Yes, it's admittedly confusing to have a service type named service, but it's not that hard to understand. Let's take a look at this very simple example of a service called circle properties that is made to calculate the properties of a circle based on its radius. The service takes a function as parameter that contains 3 properties: pi, area, and circumference. Pi is a number, while area and circumference are the functions that will calculate the properties of the same name for a given radius. To use that service in your controller or in other service, all you need to do is to inject the circle service through dependency injection and then invoke the properties you want, like this. The factory recipe is not that different in terms of use. The difference between service and factory is simple. When you use the service recipe when declaring circle properties as an injectable argument, you will be provided with an instance of the function. In other words, you'll be provided with a reference to this function. When using a factory, on the other hand, you will not be provided with the function itself, but instead with the value that is returned by invoking the function reference passed to factory. In other words, if we were to write the same circle properties service as a factory, we would do it like this. We would create a new object that contains the properties we want, and then we would return that object. And this is what we're going to get when we invoke the service in our controller. Services can also have their own dependencies. Let's get back to the factory example we created on section 3 and take a closer look into it. Here, we're invoking the $HTTP service and basically creating a layer around the API calls to abstract the HTTP calls away from the controller. This is a very common use for custom services in Angular. You ideally don't want to have URLs and explicit HTTP calls on your controllers, so it's very recommendable that you create custom services for this purpose. Speaking of HTTP, that's one of the most useful built-in services of AngularJS, but it's not the only one. In the next video, we're going to take a look at some of the most useful AngularJS built-in services and find out which ones you're supposed to use and when. I see you guys there.